What if I told you that one of the most infamous video games ever made wasn't just a flop? It was blamed for the near total collapse of an entire industry. And it wasn't some obscure, unfunded indie game. No, this was a tie-in to one of the most beloved films of all time, backed by the gaming giant Atari during its peak. Yeah, we're talking about E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial for the Atari 2600, a game that went from blockbuster hype to legend for all the wrong reasons. It's the game most gamers point to when talking about how things go horribly wrong in development and marketing. It's been called unplayable, broken, and the worst game of all time. And yet, it's also misunderstood, a victim of its era, and even in some ways ahead of its time. But is that enough to redeem it? And how did it earn its spot as a scapegoat for one of the biggest crashes in video game history? To understand why E.T. became the poster child for disaster, we need to dig deeper into its origins, where a perfect storm of unrealistic expectations, corporate greed, and rushed development collided with a game that was doomed from the start. So buckle up, this isn't just a story of a bad game, it's the story of a turning point in gaming history. To really get why E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial ended up the way it did, you have to start with the company that made it, Atari. In the early 1980s, Atari wasn't just a gaming company, it was the gaming company. Founded by Nolan Bushnell in the early 1970s, Atari had basically invented the home console market with the Atari 2600, bringing games like Pong and Space Invaders out of the arcades and into people's living rooms. By 1982, the company was riding high, selling millions of consoles and ranking in record profits. For a while, it seemed like nothing could stop them. And then there was E.T. the movie. Directed by Steven Spielberg, this heartwarming tale of a boy and an alien became a cultural phenomenon when it hit theaters in June of 1982. It broke the box office records, earning glowing reviews, and had everyone from kids to adults buzzing. Naturally, Atari wanted in on that action. The idea was simple: cash in on the film's success with a tie-in game for the 1982 holiday season. Here's where things started to go off the rails. Atari paid an eye-watering $20 to $25 million for the rights to make the game, one of the most expensive licensing deals in entertainment history. But they weren't just buying the rights to slap the E.T. name on any game. They were buying Spielberg's approval. That meant creating something that lived up to both the movie's legacy and the director's expectations. This is where the timeline gets wild. Spielberg signed off on the deal in late July of 1982. Atari's CEO at the time, Ray Kassar, promised Spielberg the game would be ready for Christmas, giving the development team about 5 weeks. Yes, 5 weeks to conceive, develop, test, and produce millions of cartridges. For context, most Atari games at the time took about 6 to 8 months to make, minimum. So yeah, they were already setting themselves up for disaster. Why the rush? Atari was locked in a fierce battle for dominance in the gaming market, not just with other console makers, but also with the rising popularity of home computers. The company was desperate to secure a holiday hit to keep its momentum going, and E.T. seemed like a surefire winner. After all, it was Spielberg, right? What could go wrong? Spielberg himself was reportedly skeptical about the project from the start. He supposedly asked Atari if they could just make something simple like Pac-Man but with an E.T. skin. But Atari's lead designer, Howard Scott Warshaw, had a different vision. Warshaw, a rising star in the industry who had already created hits like Yar's Revenge and Raiders of the Lost Ark, wanted to make something ambitious, a game that reflected the heart and soul of the movie. And to his credit, Warshaw believed he could pull it off. The stage was set. Atari had its license, its developers, and its deadline. What it didn't have was time. But in their rush to make history, they ended up creating something very different. A game that would go down in infamy as one of the most disastrous projects in gaming history. If you've ever wondered what it's like to develop a game in a pressure cooker, the story of E.T.'s development is about to get as intense as it gets. At the center of this storm, of course, is our protagonist, Howard Scott Warshaw. As mentioned earlier, he is a programmer who is as ambitious as he was talented. So when the call came to adapt E.T. into a video game, Warshaw was Atari's go-to guy. But like we said, there's a catch. Warshaw just had 5 weeks to deliver a finished product. That's 35 days to take an idea from Spielberg's desk to millions of Atari cartridges, all the while working within the limitations of the Atari's 2600 system. To put this in perspective, even games back then typically took several months to develop. 5 weeks? It was practically unheard of. Here's the kicker. Warshaw actually wanted the challenge. He relished the opportunity to create something groundbreaking. And, in fairness, he didn't go into it blind. After meeting with Spielberg, Warshaw quickly settled on a concept that he believed captured the essence of the film. The idea was simple yet ambitious. Players who could control E.T. as he wandered through a series of interconnected screens, searching for pieces of his phone so he could call home. Along the way, E.T. would have to avoid government agents, fall into pits, and collect Reese's Pieces to restore his energy. But simple and ambitious don't always mix well, especially when you're working on the Atari 2600. The console was already showing its age by 1982, with limited memory, clunky graphics, and no room for error. Warshaw had to work within a 4 KB memory limit. Yes, that's kilobytes, about the size of a single Word document today. This meant squeezing all of the game's mechanics, visuals, and audio into an impossibly small space. Warshaw also wanted to push the boundaries of what a game could be. He designed a system where players could explore a semi-open world. Each screen represented a different area, and E.T. could move between them to collect phone parts while avoiding enemies. The goal was to create a sense of freedom, something that mirrored E.T.'s journey in the movie. But the clock was ticking. With only weeks to develop the game, Warshaw had no time for extensive playtesting or refinement. Features were implemented as quickly as possible, often without the chance to smooth out rough edges. The infamous pits, for example, deep holes E.T. frequently falls into, were last-minute solutions to add complexity to the game. Unfortunately, they ended up being more frustrating than fun, trapping players in an endless loop of falling and climbing out. Meanwhile, Atari was rushing to mass-produce cartridges. The company believed the game would sell millions of units, no matter what state it was in. After all, it was E.T., right? Spielberg's name alone was supposed to guarantee success. In their eyes, Warshaw's 5-week marathon was just a formality. They didn't realize, or didn't care, that the final product might need a bit more polish. By the time the game was finished, Warshaw had pulled off what many would consider a miracle. He delivered a playable game in just over a month. But playable didn't mean good. The tight timeline meant that E.T. launched with significant issues, confusing mechanics, punishing difficulty, and little in the way of player guidance. Still, the team at Atari was optimistic. They had their game, they had their hype, and they were ready to dominate the holiday season. What they didn't have was a clue about what was coming next. For a game based on a beloved movie about friendship, wonder, and heart, playing E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial felt, well, more like an exercise in frustration. On the surface, the game's premise wasn't bad. You played as E.T., stranded on Earth, trying to collect pieces of a phone to call home. Sounds simple enough, right? But in practice, E.T.'s gameplay was anything but straightforward. The game consisted of a series of interconnected screens that represented different areas, like forests, cities, and fields. The main mechanic involved searching for phone pieces, which were randomly hidden in pits scattered throughout the map. E.T. could move across the screen in any direction, creating what some might call an early attempt to an open-world experience. But if that sounds ambitious for 1982, it's because it was, and not necessarily in a good way. The core problem with E.T.'s gameplay came down to the execution. First, there were pits. These holes were where you were supposed to find phone pieces, and they were everywhere. Accidentally stepping into one meant you'd fall down, forcing you to repeatedly levitate your way out using E.T.'s energy. An ability, while kind of cool, became tedious real fast. Even worse, it wasn't always clear where these pits were, so often players fell in without warning, turning exploration into a slog. Then there was the energy system. E.T. had a limited amount of energy which was used for everything. moving, using abilities, and escaping hazards. If you ran out, the game was over. You could restore it by collecting Reese's Pieces scattered across the map, but keeping E.T. alive felt more like a grind than an adventure. And let's talk about the hazards. The game featured two primary antagonists, a scientist and an FBI agent, both of whom were relentless in their pursuit of E.T. The scientist wanted to capture you and drag you to his lab, while the FBI agent would confiscate any phone pieces you'd collected. Neither of these threats were particularly well balanced. They showed up frequently and often seemed impossible to avoid, adding another layer of frustration to an already clunky experience. Perhaps the most baffling issue was the lack of player guidance. The game offered no tutorial, no instructions, and very little visual feedback to explain what was happening. New players were often left scratching their heads, unsure of where to go and what to do. For example, when you found a phone piece, there was no immediate indication of what it was or what it did. Combine that with the random placement of key items and the consistent interruption from enemies, and you had a recipe for confusion. Even the mechanics that were innovative for the time, like E.T.'s levitation ability or the semi-open world, suffered from poor implementation. The levitation, while novel, was slow and repetitive. The map, while expansive for a game for its era, lacked meaningful landmarks, making navigation feel aimless. And with no clear way to track progress or plan your next move, the whole experience often felt more like wandering in circles than completing a mission. To be fair, it's clear that Howard Scott Warshaw was trying to do something different with E.T. He wanted to create a game that captured the spirit of the movie, where exploration and problem solving took center stage. But the 5-week development timeline didn't allow for the polish or balance needed to make those ideas work. What players got instead was a game that felt incomplete, full of potential but riddled with flaws. It's easy to see why E.T. frustrated so many players. For a generation of kids expecting an experience as magical as the movie, what they got was confusing, punishing, and, in many cases, unplayable. And yet, despite its reputation, E.T. wasn't just a lazy cash grab. It was an experiment, an ambitious one, but one that felt short of its lofty goals.
50 years later, there's not a lot of symbols.
Atari bet big on E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. It wasn't just another game in their library. It was a game that was supposed to define the 1982 holiday season. Fueled by the runaway success of the Spielberg's movie, Atari pulled out all the stops on marketing, pouring millions of dollars into promoting the game before it even hit the shelves. They were confident, maybe too confident, that they had a guaranteed blockbuster on their hands. The hype machine was in overdrive. Advertisements for E.T. flooded the TV screens, promising an experience that would bring the magic of the movie into your living room. The messaging was clear. If you loved E.T. the movie, you'd love E.T. the game. The campaign leaned heavily on nostalgia for the film, banking on the idea that parents would snap it up as the ultimate gift for their kids. Retailers were also swept up in the frenzy, stocking shelves with the expectation that the game would fly off of them. And Atari wasn't shy about how much they were banking on E.T.'s success. The company produced an estimated 4 to 5 million cartridges, confident they would sell through all of them. The number wasn't just ambitious, it was unprecedented. To put it into perspective, even the Atari's 2600 biggest game at the time, Pac-Man, had only sold around 7 million copies. Atari was betting that E.T. would join those ranks, if not surpass them. Initially, the gamble seemed to pay off. E.T. hit the shelves in December of 1982, just in time for the holiday shopping rush, and the game sold well in its first few weeks. By some accounts, over 1 million units were sold during the initial launch, making it one of Atari's fastest-selling titles. On paper, it looked like a success. The marketing had worked, the shelves were stocked, and the game was moving. But then, returns started coming in. Almost as soon as players got their hands on E.T., the backlash began. Kids who had begged their parents for the game found themselves confused and frustrated by its punishing mechanics and lack of clarity. Many didn't even know what they were supposed to be doing. It didn't take long for word to spread that the game was, for lack of a better words, bad. And unlike today, when patches or updates can fix broken games, E.T. was what it was, unchangeable and permanent. Retailers were the first to feel the sting. After the initial rush of the holiday sales, unsold copies of E.T. began piling up in stores. Disappointed customers returned the game in droves, demanding refunds. Retailers began slashing prices in an effort to offload the unsold inventory. By early 1983, what had once been Atari's crown jewel had become an industry-wide embarrassment. The fallout didn't stop there. Atari had manufactured millions of cartridges based on widely optimistic sale projections. When the game didn't live up to its expectations, those extra copies became dead weight. Worse, the production costs for E.T., which included the record-breaking licensing deal with Spielberg, were so high that even strong initial sales weren't enough to turn a profit. By some estimates, Atari lost tens of millions of dollars on E.T. alone. But here's the thing. Atari didn't just overestimate E.T.'s potential, they overestimated their entire market. By late 1982, the video game industry was already starting to show signs of oversaturation. There were too many consoles, too many games, and not enough quality control. E.T.'s failure was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, but it was a very visible piece. For many, it became the symbol of Atari's hubris, a cautionary tale of what happens when marketing hype overshadows developmental realities. In the end, the launch of E.T. wasn't just a commercial flop. It was a breaking point, a moment when the cracks in Atari's empire began to show. What was supposed to be a triumph turned into a disaster that haunted the company for years to come. And for the industry as a whole, it became a stark warning. Even in booming markets, no game, no matter how big the name behind it, is immune to failure. So where does E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial stand today? Is it the worst game of all time, or just the most misunderstood? Maybe it's both. It's a game born from ambition, crushed by corporate greed, and immortalized by its infamy. In a way, it's the gaming industry's version of a cult B-movie. Flawed, fascinating, and endlessly talked about. The lessons left behind are as clear as they are ironic. Don't rush, don't oversell, and definitely don't bury your problems in the desert. And yet, maybe we're being a little too harsh on the little guy. After all, E.T. did manage to phone home, straight from the annals of gaming history. Sometimes it's not about how well you succeed, it's about how spectacularly you fail. So here's to E.T., the game that crashed the party, lit a dumpster fire, and made sure we'd never stop talking about it. It may not have been what anyone wanted, but it's definitely what we deserved. And isn't that what gaming history is all about? If you enjoyed exploring the history and making of E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, click this video here to see more from the Retro Reload. And, as always, thank you for watching.